And welcome to the Cape Town Press Club at Home, brought to you this week with the generous support of publisher PANMACMILLAN, and thanks to our technical producer, Murky. Remember, if you are watching this live and you logged in, you may ask a question at any time, and I'll get as many of these into our discussion afterwards. Our guest today is author and journalist Mandy Wiener, who has often been in the forefront of stories covering the murky criminal underworld. Her books include Ministry of Crime, delving into state capture, and Killing Keble, on the mysterious end of businessman Brett Keble. She also co-authored a book on the murder of Reva Steenkamp and co-authored Vusi Pikoli's memoir, which was the last time we hosted her and hosted them at the Press Club. In the course of her work, she has had many dealings and interacted with whistleblowers, and her latest book is just that, 13 Stories of Whistleblowing, about the people who have played a pivotal role in exposing wrongdoing and grand corruption. So please welcome to our virtual studio from Johannesburg, Mandy Wiener.
Thanks so much, Brent, and thank you. It's always good to be with the Cape Town Press Club.
Hi, Mandy. So, whistleblowers to journalists, sources. Whistleblowers can be martyrs, principled people who have said that they couldn't live with themselves if they did not expose the wrongdoing. They can also be the rats leaving the ship, people spilling the beans because they've been caught out. You're in favor of casting the net quite wide, spectrum, you say, in which motive is not necessarily relevant. Now, I don't know if you've seen, but I received the pre-publicity this week for a book by Angelo Agrizzi of Bazaza fame, who puts himself up there with Edward Snowden and Julian Assange. So perhaps let's begin with defining what is a whistleblower.
I also got the copy. I got it today. So yeah, my net is quite wide, and not everybody agrees with this, because I do believe that there is a spectrum of whistleblower. I think that on the one end, you've got the whistleblower who acts out of altruistic motive, who is driven by a strong sense of moral justice, and who feel that they need to speak out because it's black or white, and they can't allow this wrong to continue. And then somewhere in the middle, you've got an accidental whistleblower, somebody who does not set out to become a whistleblower, but realizes that they will be complicit if they do not speak up, and then feel that they are going to blow the whistle. And we've seen many of these come forward at the State Capture Commission as an example. And then on the far end, you do have somebody like Angelo Agrizzi, who not everyone agrees is a whistleblower, somebody who is complicit, who has been involved in wrongdoing, who acknowledges that they have done wrong, and they speak out perhaps for self-preservation, or because they are the rats that are fleeing the sinking ship. But I still feel that they remain whistleblowers. You often need people that have got proximity to wrongdoing. And as journalists, we rely on people like this as sources often. And that's a very disputed view. Not everyone feels the same way about that.
Right. I suppose, what were some of the more interesting motivations that you came across for people wanting to blow the whistle? And perhaps the question we really need to ask is, what makes people not act? Why are not more people whistleblowers and carry on knowingly do wrong? What are the kind of pressures on them? Why are whistleblowers such a minority?
So I spent a lot of time thinking about what motivates somebody, what propels them to come forward when they are with that conundrum, when they're wrestling with it, whether or not they should come forward. Because in some instances, you've got many people who hold the same information, and some of them decide to look the other way and keep quiet because they just don't have the appetite to get into this. And then you have some people that can't help themselves. And usually it is because they have got a very, very clear sense of justice, that even the smallest transgression is viewed as a major flouting of the law. And I saw a lot of people like this who are pedantic, who are meticulous, who there is no gray. It is black or white. But then there were some people, who did say to me that they felt as though they were accidental whistleblowers. They really didn't want to find themselves in this position, and it just so happened. And I think that there aren't more whistleblowers that come forward because of the repercussions for whistleblowers. They're seen as pariahs, as impimpies, as snitches, as tattletales, and that nobody wants to be disruptive in that way. So if you've got that kind of personality where you are risk averse, chances are you're not going to want to rock the boat.
Yeah, maybe I just want to pick up on that. You used the word impimpi, which I think is very significant. So Is that because of our struggle history? Impimpi's were the informers. Do you think that there is a sort of a closing of the ranks that happens within government and within perhaps the ANC, and maybe within corporations even? But does that struggle history still play a role?
I think it does to a degree. And in fact, I did an interview with Professor Tina Ace, who's at UJ, who wrote a paper on this very issue, on South Africa's history of Mpimpis and how it feeds into a lack of whistleblower culture today. And she looked at it from two angles. The one was that you're seen as an Mpimpi, as with that long history, that you're seen as being treacherous in a way, and that you are betraying the company. But then she also looked at the issue of Ubuntu in South Africa and that sense of community and acting for others and for the community. And in some ways, whistleblowing was seen as an act of Ubuntu because it was seen as for the betterment of the group. So I think that we are unique in many ways in South Africa about how we deal with whistleblowers and the way society perceives whistleblowers, how we treat them. And I think a lot of that has to do with our history in South Africa.
So what is our legal framework? I mean, how does that define whistleblowers? I mean, I know the Protected Disclosures Act. Now, as journalists, we know about that. But I think most people have never heard of it, in fact. And does it actually protect them?
So you're right. The Protected Disclosure Act is the main piece of legislation in South Africa that looks at whistleblowing. But many of the researchers, lawyers, whistleblowers that I interviewed for this book say that it is very much an employment type law, that it works in theory. It was broadened. It was amended in 2017, which allowed for whistleblowers to report to various structures that previously they couldn't report to. So in theory, it works well, but in practice, it doesn't. A lot of whistleblowers saying that it's not worth the paper that it's written on, and that the only recourse really or penalty for a company is 2 years worth of salary. It's not implemented properly. There's no accountability for corporates. So many say that it's not effective in this country, and it only applies really to a corporate environment. It doesn't apply to people that are kind of man in the street type individuals. So many of them just felt that it didn't work.
I think you give the example in the book about, if you try and expose police brutality or police criminality, you aren't necessarily protected. Who can whistleblowers go to? What organizations? Who can they go to and be protected by the Act?
So this is much broader now because of the Protected Disclosures Act and the amendment in 2017. So I can't recall the exact list now, but it is pretty much the public protector. I think it is the, any of these Chapter 9 organizations. You can go to a lawyer. You can go to an NGO. So there is a much broader list of places where you can go now if you are a whistleblower. But what many of the whistleblowers I spoke to said is that people should really get legal advice first and understand who they're allowed to go to and who they're not, and when they are protected, so that they don't err right at the outset when they are setting out to blow the whistle.
So in a way, it's the way our politics and our law is structured. I think that, the feeling might be that wrongdoers are more likely to be rewarded and left alone and untouched, while people who are trying to do the right thing find their lives in tatters and really suffer. I'm thinking of Suzanne Daniels, the Eskom whistleblower that you write about. Perhaps you should tell us a little bit more. Tell us a bit about her story, and in the context of the rewards and the pain.
So Suzanne Daniels is a very complicated character, and I think I've probably answered more questions about her than anybody else in the book for this exact reason. So she, of course, was the company secretary at Eskom, and she decided to blow the whistle to the parliamentary inquiry at Eskom, and she came forward there and blew the whistle. However, there is definitely a grouping within Eskom that believes that she was complicit with the Guptas, with Salim Essa, and in fact, she is listed as one of the respondents in the court action recently filed by Eskom against the Guptas and Salim Essa and Machela Koko and various other executives as well. So there is a belief that she was involved because of her proximity. So recently, she went to the Zondo Commission of Inquiry and faced a pretty tough time again. She gave this testimony about how Salim Essa had apparently offered her 800 million rand in cash at a petrol station, which she said that she just laughed off because she was thinking about how she was going to wallpaper her house with that amount of cash and how it would even fit into a bag. And she faced a bit of a grilling from Zondo because he didn't quite believe her. In his view, when she spoke about the fact that she went to go and meet Salim Essa and the Guptas after this incident had taken place out of a morbid sense of curiosity. So she was given quite a tough time, and I think that firmed up the public perception around her, that she in fact wasn't a whistleblower, that she was complicit. But she maintains that she is a whistleblower. She came forward with information. We wouldn't know about the inner workings of Optimum and Eskom and how that deal worked and what happened with the Guptas and Machela Koko and Salim Essa were it not for her testimony at the parliamentary inquiry. And in her view, she believes that Zondo doesn't understand how to deal with whistleblowers, and she has really been traumatized. She is also unemployed. She has really suffered the emotional strain of being through it. I saw her a few days after the Zondo Commission, and she was really quite broken by it. And this is an example of a whistleblower who, in their view, comes forward because they feel that they have to protect the country and expose wrongdoing, but because they perhaps waited too long, they are seen as complicit. And for that reason, they really face a lot of negativity and criticism.
Yeah, it's a very you tell it very movingly in the book. I've always been of the belief that full and open disclosure is actually your best protection. I mean, when journalists come to us and they say they're worried about a hit being taken out on them or whatever, we say let's get it out in the public as quickly as possible. I mean, there's no point in knocking off somebody if they've put everything that they know already on the record. I mean, you can't shut them up after that, unless, of course, it's revenge. And if somebody takes revenge, that also poses a risk to the person taking the revenge. But some have paid the ultimate price, and you write about several in the book. You get off to a dramatic start with the gunning down of Mos Parko, who was trying to reveal gross and extensive corruption in the Rustenburg municipality. Perhaps you can tell us about that.
So there's a few stories in the book that really were quite difficult to tell because they involved people being killed for exposing corruption. And Mos Parko is very much one of those. And Mos Parko was the quintessential civil servant. He grew up in the ANC. He was an ANC councillor in Rustenburg, and he was meticulous. He was the kind of guy who would sit in council meetings and make sure that every line item was accounted for and would question every single cent that was spent. And he started to pick up this issue around corruption in Rustenburg, and this was in the mid-2000s. And together with some of his colleagues, he started to build the dossier of corruption. And primary to this and central to this was the character of the mayor of Rustenburg, Matthew Wolmarans. And they took this dossier to senior members of the ANC, to Gwede Mantashe, to Ayanda Dlodlo, and eventually to Jacob Zuma in Nkandla, where they spent a couple of days with him there. And it eventually ended in 2009 with a meeting with Sikelo Shiteka and the mayor, Matthew Wolmarans, where Mos Parko presented this dossier of corruption. And at that meeting, he said to the mayor, "You can hate me, but don't hurt me." And a day later, he was shot dead in his driveway in Rustenburg. He had spent the day hanging up posters for the ANC election. He had a t-shirt with Jacob Zuma's face on it. His car had Jacob Zuma posters on it. And he drove into his driveway. A gunman arrived at his door and shot him dead. And for a long time, this murder went unsolved. And then ultimately what happened was the mayor, Matthew Wolmarans, and his bodyguard were prosecuted and were convicted and were sent to jail for a year until the matter went on appeal to the Supreme Court, where or to the High Court in Mafeking, and it was overturned. And Matthew Wolmarans has always claimed his innocence, and in fact, he became a member of parliament after that. And for the family of Moss Parkway, they really feel that they were betrayed by the justice system, that they were forgotten, that they were let down. And his son Tsolo already carries that burden. He speaks so movingly and so passionately about what's happened to his family and how they've been forgotten, and it really is an incredibly touching story, but it does expose what is the worst case scenario for whistleblowers.
Right. Yes, I was just looking now actually at a very photograph full of pathos of Loliwe Ngwenya, and just to mention actually the photographs taken by Felix Dlangamandla are quite wonderful and a nice addition to the book. Loliwe was one of the people who paid a price because of the Estina dairy farm. What happened there?
So Loliwe's father, Boy Ngwenya, was one of the intended beneficiaries of the Estina dairy farm. And we've heard a lot about the Freda dairy farm and what happened there. And ostensibly what happened was the politicians went in, they said, oh, you're going to get this big dairy farm contract and the farmers are going to benefit. But in fact, what really happened was they took their ID numbers, they never got anything. And instead the money went to sending Ace Makashula's choir or Musabenzi's Zwane's choir to overseas on a trip, and it went to funding the Gupta's big fancy wedding in Sun City. So my colleagues have written about the numbers and the money trail and the Dubai laundromat and how all of that happened. But I really wanted to focus on the human story here of what happened to the individuals involved. And Boy Ngwenya was very outspoken. He did many interviews about it, about how he felt that the politicians were milking them dry instead of allowing them to become beneficiaries of the dairy farm. And Boy Ngwenya died under very suspicious circumstances. He was found in what is essentially a shack on his farm, which overlooks the Freda dairy farm. And his daughter, Loliwe, was really broken about what had happened to her father. She maintains that he died as a result of speaking out so publicly against the Estina dairy farm and the Guptas and the politicians involved. And she too, she now looks after her father's cattle. She took me to the farm. There are some very poignant photographs taken by Felix of her on her farm, which overlooks the dairy farm, which she and so many others have just never benefited from.
What kind of changes do you think need to be made to support and encourage whistleblowing, given the levels of corruption that we face in this country? Is anyone pursuing this, like the Dutch example? And maybe you can tell us a little bit like Thabisa Zulu. He talks about his very disappointing experience of being in the witness protection program.
Yeah, so I make various recommendations for what I think needs to happen. And Thabisa Zulu is a great example because he's a whistleblower who also exposed corruption in KwaZulu-Natal, and he has been central to the political killings. Sandiso Makaka, who was the ANC councillor who was shot, gave him information about the Umzimkhulu Memorial Center and the corruption around it. And Thabiso's been very outspoken about this. But he had to actually go to court to force the police minister to put him into witness protection, which he didn't even want to go into. He didn't want to go into witness protection. He just wanted protection to be given to him, which is what happens in Ghana, as I understand it. That's how their law works. And there are options that we could look at. We could look at something like that. We could look at what happens in the United States with the False Claims Act or the Lincoln Law, where independent citizens are entitled to go after companies as whistleblowers themselves, and then they are entitled to a percentage of the money that is recovered. And this has been the issue that was raised by Bianca Goodson in her letter to Eskom, and also in her letter to the president, saying that we should consider this. But I propose something like we see in the Netherlands, which is a whistleblower house, which is a civil society organization that is funded by government, but it's run as an independent entity, and it's there to provide support, physical, emotional, legal, psychological, security to whistleblowers.
Would that be another sort of Chapter 9 institution that we could create?
So that's the way that I see it. I know that there are other people that don't agree with it because they feel like we can't allow government to be involved in any way, in any kind of structure. Other people have suggested that each industry or each sector has got its own funded whistleblower support system or organization. I think that there are various entities that we could look at that would better support whistleblowers. And I'm hoping that this book has started a conversation around this and that it does build momentum, because we need to see something definitely changing.
So is there anybody at the moment agitating for this? So is there any NGO, any legal outfit that's busy promoting this, or is lobbying for it, or trying to get things changed?
Yeah, so there's a few. So Outer, the organization Undoing Tax Abuse, is one of those, definitely, that is driving it. We had a webinar recently where they also discussed what could be done by civil society. Cynthia Stimple, I know, is also part of an organization. I see she's commented on the chat as well, so she's watching, and she's also setting up an organization to support whistleblowers. So there are a few. The PLAF is also an organization that supports whistleblowers, that has been behind Bianca Goodson and Musilo Muteko. So the conversation is starting, but it just needs to gather momentum, and hopefully we will see more organizations agitating for this.
Right. I wanted to also just ask you that, what advice would you give to someone who wants to be in the sequel?
So there's a lot of advice in the book, and I make a point of asking all the whistleblowers who I interview to give advice, and some of it is practical. So, for example, keep a diary. Make sure that you collect as many papers, evidence as you can before you blow the whistle, and you have all of that in order. SMSs, WhatsApps, these different apps that you can use to make sure that you secure all of that. Some of it's practical, other advice is more figurative. So make sure that you've got a good support structure, make sure that your family is on board, make sure that you've got enough funding, because you're going to get dragged through the courts. My advice would be, I really didn't want people to read this book and be deterred from blowing the whistle. I want to encourage whistleblowers to come forward, but a lot has to change in the framework in South Africa for that to happen. So I would encourage whistleblowers to make sure they know exactly what they're in for, but that they should really consider doing it, because we need whistleblowers to come forward if we're going to fight corruption.
Right. Yeah, well, despite your fears that because of the stories that you tell, people might be discouraged, I actually think it's a very inspiring book, and I think it actually will have the opposite effect. So I think very well done on that. It's extremely well written. I know how very difficult it is to tell such incredibly complicated stories in an intelligible and in a readable way, and it's full of helpful observations, and they also move the story along. So congratulations on that. Some of the titles read like movie titles, actually, so that you have Captain Kirk and the Starship Etoll, Murder Inc. in the Wild East, Stalin and the Chicken. But I wanted to move to a slightly different area now. If you could tell us a little bit more. So we've talked mostly about government corruption really so far, but what about the thing in terms of unpaid benefits, which I found an interesting chapter?
So the chapter was really challenging to write in many ways, because it tells the story of Rosemary Hunter on the one hand, who was this very successful lawyer who had her own practice regarding pension funds, and she decided to go into civil service, and she became the deputy commissioner at the FSCA. And when she got there, she started looking at this issue of the unpaid benefits and started digging around and making a bit of a noise about it. And then on the other side, you've got Michelle Mitchley, who worked for Liberty. And in her job at Liberty, she was working on this payout project, and she started to pick up some problems there with what was happening with these unclaimed benefits. And the whole concept of unclaimed benefits I found a bit difficult to wrap my head around, because it can get quite technical. But you had these two women fighting from different sides, like burrowing through a tunnel to one another. Michelle Mitchley phoned an internal hotline to complain, to whistleblow, and that complaint went to the FSCA. And Rosemary Hunter then came upon this complaint, and the two women managed to find each other, and in many ways started working together. In fact, Rosemary Hunter went all the way to the Constitutional Court to challenge how the FSCA was dealing with this unpaid benefits scheme, and Michelle ended up leaving her job at Liberty. But both of these cases of these two women was just an absolute commitment to exposing wrongdoing, because neither of them had anything to gain from this. It was very much about what Thuli Madonsela calls the Gogo Dlaminis in society. It was about the beneficiaries of pensions who didn't even know that they had money that was owed to them, and they could have been from Kuruman or wherever. And Rosemary Hunter felt so compelled to fight for this that she put her entire career and her reputation on the line, and she was dragged through, or she went to the Constitutional Court, but she lost a lot of money as a result of it. And both of these women are just an example of whistleblowers who are propelled by a strong sense of moral justice, who just feel that they need to speak up because something wrong is being done.
Yeah, and also a fascinating story for me was the bread cartel, and the price of bread was being fixed. Maybe you could tell us a bit about that.
Well, again, this is corporate sector, where you've got collusion by the biggest bread manufacturers in the country, and then you've got this guy in Elsie's River who is a bread distributor, Imran Mukadam, who just thought, well, I'm not going to let this happen because it's affecting the poorest people in society who are counting every cent when they are paying for their bread. And Imran Mukadam, he had this very successful bread distribution company in Elsie's River. His family had started it, and he started to work out that there was this collusion on bread price fixing. And he complained to the Competition Commission, and they started investigating, and it really blew up. He as this lone guy was able to hold these big corporates to account. And in fact, he too went all the way to the Constitutional Court and was able to change the law around this, which he counts as one of the greatest legacies that he has left. Because again, here's an example of a guy who had a successful company. He could have just shut up and he could have carried on making money from the community, but now he's lost that business. It is nowhere near as lucrative as it was. He has actually leveraged his position as a whistleblower to become a social justice activist. But the price has been great for him too.
Yes, it was a good story, and I think there was a report by the World Bank a few years ago that they showed that just by breaking up the cartels around certain foodstuffs, such as I think it was flour and bread and one or two others, milk, they had managed to lift a significant number of people. I can't remember exactly the figure, but in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people out above the poverty line, simply by changing the price of such basic foodstuffs that were being filled. So that's a good story. There are a lot of good stories in this as well, in the book. And you also get into the FIFA stadium in Mbombela. That was a good one too. Can you tell us a bit more about that, please, Mandy?
It was good to an extent, but again, the story in many ways tracks what happened to Moss Parkway in Rustenburg, because while this corruption was exposed and there were lots of twists and turns, it involved obviously the development of the stadium in Mbombela, the one with the giraffes. And what happened again is you've got this really committed civil servant in Jimmy Mukhlala, who was the speaker of the municipality in Mbombela, and he started to pick up this corruption around the 2010 stadium build. Also, around the same time in 2009, as Moss Parkway was speaking out, and Jimmy was about to go lay charges against some of his comrades in the ANC about what had happened, and on a Sunday evening, he had just driven into his driveway, and his son, Tsepiso, who was a teenager at the time, was standing outside with him, and gunmen opened fire. And Tsepiso was shot through the leg, and Jimmy was shot and ended up dying inside his house. And a couple of days later, his wife, Bonnie, and Tsepiso, who had been wounded, were picked up by the cops and interrogated and roughed up because the cops tried to force them into a confession, which they had nothing to do with. And the story very much tracks the capture of the National Prosecuting Authority, how there was interference in the prosecution of the 2010 corruption case. That fell apart. A hitman came forward who claimed that the deputy president had hired him to shoot Jimmy. There was no credibility to it. There was a court case that fell apart. And in the end, no one has been prosecuted for shooting Jimmy. And his family also feel like they've been forgotten. And incredibly, though, his son, Tsepiso, who was wounded, speaks so powerfully about this legacy of truth that his father has left him. And it's just incredible to see the maturity that he deals with it, that, you know, completely acknowledging his father was a whistleblower and this is what he had to die for.
Yes, I found that courage of his very encouraging. Well, somebody who was almost synonymous with whistleblowing for a little while, or certainly used it for political ends and played it up, was Patricia DeLille. And you talk about her quite early on in the book and the arms deal. Perhaps we can revisit that time.
So the thing with the arms deals is that there were lots of different whistleblowers. We know that there were various whistleblowers that I could have written about, but I chose to write about Patricia DeLille because in many ways she is something of a good news story for whistleblowers, where she was able to leverage her political career off the back of it. And I don't write about her recent controversies in any way. I don't look at anything about the Beitbridge border fence or her term as Public Works Minister. I just look at that section of time when she stood up in Parliament and revealed what is now known as the DeLille dossier, and how it was given to her in this clandestine meeting with who we now know was Becky Jacobs, who had various other names, this ANC operative. And there were these meetings at Rhodes Memorial where they were getting documents at the boot of the car, and there were people who were following them from the Spur in Claremont. It really is the stuff of a spy thriller. But she was able to stand up in Parliament with this dossier that had been put together, we understand, by members of the ANC, who we still don't know who they are, and expose corruption in the arms deal. So I tell that story and what the implications were for her and what happened there. But then I also tell the story of another whistleblower that we don't know much about at all in the arms deal, which was Sue Delique, who was the PA to French arms company Tint, Elaine Titard, who was the boss of Tint. And this is just a really quaint story, because you've got this woman who was very eccentric. She lived in a horsey suburb in Joburg, and the prosecutors, Gerda Ferreira and Billy Downer, had come across this information that she had the encrypted facts, which became central to the Sheikh prosecution, and how she couldn't find it initially, and wasn't sure what happened to it. And then there's this rainy meeting at her house, and the cat's walking all over the document with muddy paws, and Gerda Ferreira sitting with this fur wrapped over her shoulders. It's just a really entertaining story, but it's somebody who we don't know very much about at all.
Yes, I'm sure there are thousands of unknown whistleblowers, out there. Since we're the press club, what advice have you got, sage advice from your experience, have you got to tell journalists when whistleblowers approach them? How should they deal with that situation? How should they deal with the whistleblowers? What advice do you have?
Well, as all journalists know, whistleblowers are fundamental as sources for us, and need to be cultivated, but also need to be protected, and that's primary, is protecting them. And I tell the story in the book of the Gupta leaks, and how Branko at the Daily Maverick and Stefans at Amabungani were central to protecting Stan and John, who came forward with this hard drive that revealed these emails from within the belly of the Gupta Empire. And the way that they looked after those whistleblowers is really an example to so many other people. Because as journalists, we often want to rush to print. We want to, make sure that we get the headline and then forget about the people who've given us the story. In fact, Musilo Motsepo, the Trillion whistleblower, gave me a really powerful quote for the opening of the book, although her story is not told because she's writing her own book. But she speaks about how journalists get the awards, NGOs get the money, and whistleblowers get forgotten about. And it's really important as journalists that we protect the whistleblowers, firstly, but that we also value them and look after them. Because I do think we've got a responsibility to do that they are not placed in a vulnerable position, that they're not exposed, that they don't need to risk more than they already do. If they want to remain anonymous, they are entitled to. And we need to ensure that we have integrity about how we do that.
Yes, the Gupta leak story, as you tell it, certainly has one on the edge of one's seat. And I think a lot of people are distracted today by the American elections, where hopefully there'll be lots of whistleblowers about any shenanigans that go on there. We've got a Facebook question that came from Vilma Maritz. I'll just read it to you. Wendy Addison, who exposed LeisureNet, also lost everything. She was reduced to begging in Britain before she managed to put her life back on track. If a corporation is found guilty, some people are sentenced to jail, and there should also be a financial sentence in the shape of paying all of the whistleblowers' legal costs. I understand the points that are made. I don't know about the case. Do you, Mandy?
Yeah, I do. So Wendy Addison is, interestingly enough, a lot of the whistleblowers that are currently coming forward for state capture have mentioned her as a kind of beacon, who they have reached out to, because she now runs this organization in the UK that supports whistleblowers. So many of them have contacted her to give guidance and support. So she's very much, her story was that she was the LeisureNet whistleblower. She landed up on the streets begging, and then went to the UK, or that happened in the UK, and then landed up starting this organization, which now does a lot of support for whistleblowers. And I hear the point on the fact that corporates should be forced to pay whistleblowers legal costs. What happens in many cases in South Africa is that whistleblowers are just dragged through the courts for years because corporates can, or government can, because they've got the funding. And that's why an organization like PLUF or ATA is so important, because what PLUF does is it signs a contract with whistleblowers where it will support you financially. So that takes that burden away. But what Bianca Goodson has suggested is that we do see whistleblowers receiving some remuneration for what they do.
Because you mentioned the Americans giving a certain percentage of money, but that could produce perverse incentives, don't you think?
Very much so. So that is one of the consequences, is that people could be motivated. You see lots of false claims coming forward, and I think there is a rule like 3, and you can't bring another one if it's wrong. You also see a lot of bounty hunters coming forward, but it has been effective. If you look at the amount of money that has been recovered by organizations in the States, it really does seem to be working, and it is effective. Just last week, a whistleblower in the US was paid $141 million, for information to the Securities Exchange. The whistleblower is anonymous, but that's a huge amount of money for a whistleblower to receive. And when you contrast that with what happens to whistleblowers here, many of them are left unemployed, broke, they're unemployable, nobody wants to touch them, whereas they should be appointed to boards of companies, and there should be ethics officers.
Right. I think I want to throw up this comment from Cynthia Stimple, please. She knows Wendy Addison too. Calls Speak Up, Speak Out. She runs a course, Courageous Conversation. So there we've got the names. And of course, Cynthia is with Citizens of Conscience. But there's also a risk of being sued for defamation or damage to the corporation. Is that a real possibility, and is that a real threat?
Yeah, that happened to Musilo Motepo when she went to the public protector and exposed Trillian and McKinsey and regiments. She landed up being criminally charged. Instead of her being used as a witness, she was criminally charged and dragged through the courts for what she did and sued for defamation. And that's also, you know, she really suffered the financial and the traumatic repercussions of that, because she spoke up, she wasn't involved in wrongdoing, and she landed up being the accused. And then listen, I imagine Angelo Grisi would argue the same thing. You know, he would say that even though he was complicit, he came forward to the Zondo Commission, to the NPA, to SARS, and yet the NPA has very much been gunning for him, which his lawyers say send a message that if you are involved, you shouldn't come forward because you'll be treated the same way.
You mentioned Ghana earlier, which probably has the best legislation on the continent for whistleblowing, and yet it doesn't necessarily have the best results. So what is lacking in that context?
To be honest, I don't necessarily know enough about Ghana specifically to be able to answer that with authority. But many of the experts that I spoke to did put that forward as one of the models for us to look at, particularly around the fact that in Ghana, if you are a whistleblower, then you are automatically, the courts are compelled to ensure that the police do protect you as a whistleblower. And that personal security is such an important thing, where if you are speaking out, then you don't need to go to court to force the police. It is a given. And that definitely is one of the options for us to look at here.
Good. So it seems like it's going to need a lot of changes, not just legal. It's going to need societal changes in the way that we treat people and look at them, and support mechanisms, and it's going to use civil society is going to have to play a role here. But it does look like, and I think this may well be it is a conversation starter. I think the book will make a difference. I think it has given a lot of people more awareness. Beautifully told stories, very, very clear, very readable. Congratulations and thank you, Mandy. We're going to wrap up for today. And we look forward to seeing everybody next with Rebone Tau talking about the rise and fall of the ANC Youth League.